Hi sewing friends, welcome to my sewing room. It's nice to be with you today. My name is Beth and today I'm celebrating National Jelly Roll Day by making a quilt. I made my own jelly roll. I didn't have one, so I thought, I have fabric so I can make my own jelly roll. That's what I did, so I'll make my strips and then I made this really fun quilt. Let's get started. For my jelly roll, homemade jelly roll I should say, I was aiming for 40 strips of fabric. So what I did is I chose some oranges and yellows and warm colors, and I chose 10 fabrics from my stash, and I will be cutting 2 strips from each of these, 2.5 inch strips from my 10 colorful fabrics. And here they are laid out with the neutrals that I also chose, some very light, creamy prints and stripes. After I cut my 2.5 inch strips of the darker fabrics, I chose 10 light colored fabrics, and I'm showing you an up close of this interesting fabric here. And I will be cutting again 2 strips from 10 different fabrics, 10 different fabrics, 2.5 inch strips, and 2 strips from each fabric. This quilt is sort of a design as you go. I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to cut my strips. I knew I wanted at least 5 together, so I put 5 strips of the light together, 5 strips of the dark together, and when it was all said and done, I ended up putting all of those 10 fabrics into one big piece of fabric. So there are all 10 fabrics in these pieces that I sewed together, and they ended up to be about 20 inches wide, just a little bit more than 20 inches wide when all of the strips were together. So in the end, I had 2 panels of the colorful oranges and yellows and golds, 2 panels of that, and then 2 panels of my light colored strips. After I pressed my big panels here, I gave myself a straight edge and I tried to get as close as I could. I wanted to conserve as much of this fabric as I could, and I cut my big chunks of fabric into 20-inch squares, and I was able to get 2 squares from this first panel, and I stopped right there. I'm going to save my other panel for the border. So with this first panel, I cut 2 20-inch squares. I did the same thing with one of my lighter panels. I cut 2 20-inch squares, and then I cut my squares in half diagonally, which was a little bit tricky because this is such a big square. I used my long ruler and I held my breath and I remembered that it's okay, it's just a quilt. And I used the 45-degree line on my ruler, and I used the lines on my cutting mat here, just trying to line it up straight. And my ruler is not long enough to go that whole way down to the corner, so I was trusting that that line, that 45-degree line, is lined up to the top, or it's right at the bottom of your where you're viewing it. And then I cut these in half diagonally. So I'm going to have 4 triangles from these white or light colored fabrics, and I'll have 4 triangles from my colorful fabric. This is the beginning of my quilt. I'm sort of making a really big pinwheel with my lights and my darks. And I pinned it up on my design wall, and then I sewed 2 triangles together. And since I cut these in half, it's kind of hard to explain, but I didn't leave myself a seam allowance. So those strips that I have there will not match. The dark strips and the light strips will not come together exactly. Pressing and putting my big pinwheel together, I figured out what I needed for the border, and I did a little bit of math, not a whole lot, and I decided that an 8-inch border all around would work. If I cut these big panels into 8-inch strips, I would be able to get around my little quilt here. So I'm going to cut a very close, as close as I can to the edge, get a straight edge, and cut my fabric into 8-inch segments. And I was able to get 5 of the 8-inch segments out of each of these panels. So here it is on my design wall with some of those strips all ready to go. As I was thinking about how I was going to put this together, I again wanted to alternate the light and the dark, and this is what I had left, my leftover pieces that I'll need to use for the corners. So first I put a light and a dark strip together, and I added that to both sides of my quilt. I had to move to the floor where there was a little more room and decide how I was going to deal with the last bit of this quilt border. And I'm going to again put a light and a dark together, and then I'll need to add just a little bit more on each end. I needed a little bit extra on each of these border pieces, so I took the last 2 strip sets that I had, these 8-inch wide strip sets, and I took my seam ripper and I kind of cut them in half. I guess I took the seam out, so now I have 5 strips to add to each end of the top and the bottom of my quilt, and that should be just enough for what I need. I added those smaller segments to each end of these last 2 pieces of my border. I added a light piece to the light sides and a dark piece to the dark side, and then I was ready to finish up my quilt. After getting that top and bottom piece on this quilt top, this is all I had left on those 4 ends. Just 1 and a little bit. I said 1.5, but it's really not even quite 1.5. It's just a tiny bit of fabric that I had to trim off after adding the top and bottom border to this really beautiful quilt made with 40 strips of 2.5-inch fabric, just like a jelly roll. So this jelly roll, homemade jelly roll, had dark fabric and light fabric, and I was able to make this really beautiful quilt. Thanks for sewing with me today, and I'll see you next time.